Hello and welcome back to Time Out for Trade. I'm your host, Macy Oplinsky, and today we're back with Senior Trade Advisor Ann Jordanek to go over frequently asked questions when it comes to duty drawback. This is our third and final episode, so if you haven't watched 1 and 2, make sure to go back and listen to those before coming back to number 3. Thanks again, Ann, for making the time. So happy to see you again.
No problem. My favorite topic.
So let's just jump right into some of the questions we've been getting. How much recovery should be expected for drawback to be worth it?
So I normally tell people that it does depend, but nowadays you really have to be hitting the mark of about 100,000 a year to really make it worthwhile. Unfortunately, with the reciprocal tariffs now, it's probably not a problem for most companies to hit that 100,000 mark. And we do have some companies that we file less than that, like they might bring in 1 or 2 huge machines where it's just one transaction coming in and one going out. And they might only be getting back like 10 or 20,000, so it's worthwhile. But otherwise, yeah, you really need to be getting back a significant amount to make it worthwhile. And it really relates to, some of the audit risks that I know we're going to discuss in a little while, as well as the documentation requirements, having the resources to put together the program. It's quite a bit of work.
And can the process be pretty lengthy? Could you break down the whole process for those of us who have questions on the different phases?
Yeah. So initially, the company, a lot of times I will get questions, how do they identify opportunities? Because they might have multiple factories, multiple distributions. So in the first phase, you really want to identify those opportunities. And it's the old 80-20 rule. You want to get refunds, usually 80% of your refund is going to be on 20% of your product. So you don't necessarily want to grab everything because it can get very complex, especially if they're not the importer, they're not the exporter or something like that, which, by the way, they can recover drawback in those situations, but it just makes it more complex. And so initial is kind of discovery, and then we go through development for the applications or rulings that have to be filed with customs. And that usually is going to take like a month or two. It really depends on how many resources the company has to devote to this process. Then we file the ruling if there's a ruling required, and that usually takes about 6 months, but it can take more. It can take a year or more. The applications, the special privilege applications, usually take about 6 months. Customs really is required to respond within about 120 days, but typically they'll respond within 120 days with questions, which kind of starts the clock again. But I usually say it's about 6 months. So if you're doing manufacturing, it'll be about a year before you really see your first refunds with customs. If it's unused, it could be 4 to 6 months. But yeah, it's a long time frame. But again, once they're approved, you can get your refunds back within about 30 days. And that first year, we can begin filing claims while we're waiting for the approvals, but they're not going to issue any refunds until the approvals. So at least they might be able to say or put on the books, hey, we're expecting, and if they're going back 5 years, say it's 100,000 a year, it might be $500,000 they're looking at getting back. And they can kind of put those in the books, but the refunds won't be received until after final approval of everything.
Right. Do you mind if we transition into audits for a second?
No.
Are there different levels of audits?
Yeah, and we kind of use the terminology audit, but technically there are some what we call desk reviews that really aren't an audit. So initially there is basically a review of the business records that are involved in a typical drawback claim, like for the application process, for example. So there's sample records that are accumulated that are necessary as part of the approval process. And it's really tracing one item from export back through import and all of the business records that are involved. And that is submitted with the applications. After that, customs normally reviews the first drawback claim, And it's a similar process. They select certain transactions on the claim, and they want to see all the business records that relate to those transactions. There's also reviews, for example, if you have refunds on the import entries that are designated on a drawback claim. Customs doesn't have a lot of visibility in their system as to whether, for example, a PSC that's filed on an entry, whether that refund was taken into consideration when the drawback claim was filed. So they want you to review those before they can liquidate. Then there's also on-site audits that can be performed by the drawback liquidators. Doesn't happen very often, but every company at some point will have like these on-site audits. They focus on a lot of the larger industries like petroleum, for example. If you have a big recovery, you can expect to have an on-site audit. But again, it's similar to the desk review that I mentioned. And they're going to give you at least 30 days notice. You can ask for an extension, and they'll give you a list of exactly what they're going to review. They're going to pick transactions out of drawback claims that they're going to want to review. So you have time to prep those records. And we've already vetted the records through the application process. So there really isn't too much concern in that. But then the OR&R audits from a reg audit, those are much more lengthy. By the way, the on-site audit by the drawback offices usually lasts about half a day to a day. The OR&R audits can take like 3 days or so. And they will be on site. They review quite a few more records. But again, they give you advance notice, and they come in and they'll spend their time and review everything, but we get it all prepped in advance.
You listed quite a few. How many are there in total?
Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's basically 6 or 7 different types of reviews that you go through. There's also, actually, I forgot to mention the annual review as part of the accelerated payment application. You're supposed to go through an annual review of your program as well.
Wow. What extra documents do you need to provide to your broker when you're filing?
The actual filing process, we don't necessarily need documents. In fact, we really don't want documents because we don't want to do data entry anymore. What we really look for is import and export reports, as well as bills of material for manufacturing. But the business records need to be retained for 3 years after liquidation, as I mentioned in the first episode. So it can be quite a long period that they need to retain these business records. And when I say business records, I'm talking about everything from import through export, including purchase orders, sales orders, inventory records, receiving inventory, withdrawal from inventory. For manufacturing, we need production records. There might be additional inventory records because you have raw material inventory and then you have finished goods inventory, and as well as the accounts payables and receivables.
Why would you need to provide the accounts payables and receivables when filing?
So the accounts payables just demonstrate it's kind of part of the look over for the duty calculations, just to verify that the proper values are being used on the entry and also being designated for drawback. But the accounts receivables to show that your customer is paid for the goods helps as part of the audit process as proof of export. Believe it or not, years ago, there were companies that would fraudulently create export bills of ladings and invoices, and they were claiming drawback. And when customs auditors came in and said, "Where's your accounts receivables?" they didn't have any. So that's why that's part of the audit process.
I see. And then our last and final question, probably the one that you might get the most, but how do you remain compliant when filing in general? Could you explain some of the best practices?
Sure. The record retention is key. Obviously, they have to make sure that they have the records available should customs audit. Also, for the accelerated payment, there's an annual review. So you want to make sure that that annual review is performed. So in order to do that, you want to make sure that you have the copies of your applications and rulings available, and they should be the most recent copies. Part of the annual review is if you have any changes to your program, you have to notify customs in writing. So all of that should be documented. And a good way to do that is to have a written SOP and make sure that it's updated. Make sure you have somebody designate to oversee your drawback program and make sure that it's staying in compliance and stay up to date with the regulations and statute, should the laws change or regulations change. I mean, drawback's been around since 1789, but there's been a lot of changes to it over the years.
Awesome. Well, that will wrap up today's episode of Time Out for Trade. Again, thank you so much and for joining us, sharing your insights, and giving us all the details on duty drawback. Don't forget to follow us on social media for updates for more content on A.N. Deringer. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.
Yep. And just a brief mention, if you don't ask for your money back, customs just keeps it. So you might as well try it. Go for it. That's what I tell people.
That's a good tip.
Thanks, Macy.
Thanks, Ann.